All right, can everybody see my screen? Or somebody give me a wave if they can see it. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks for the introduction, Becky. I just today we had our state board meeting, and I just finished my term as the chair of the board. So, but I'm still on there as a public member. So, so happy to be here talking with all of you as public members as well. And hopefully this presentation is resource page worthy. I'm going to be talking to you all today about how to integrate public members and other policymakers into the standard setting process. I know we have a lot of different backgrounds the folks do on this call, so we're not going to get too far into the nitty gritty of the standard setting process. Big picture issues is what I'm really going to focus on, and what a standard setting panel or what a public member at an organization what they kind of need to know and how they might be involved. And hopefully I can convince you in this presentation that a public member does have a role to play in the process of standard setting. It's not just about psychometricians and subject matter experts. First of all, what is standard setting? What's a standard setting study? Well, if you have a credentialing exam, almost pretty much everybody has a pass-fail decision, and that's based on a score on the exam. It's the number you need to get right to pass, right? And that has to come from somewhere, right? And some people think, you know, in some cases it's just 75%. That's what some people are used to using, and so maybe that's a number they're comfortable with. But really, it's more sophisticated than that, because just like an exam needs to be job related for it to be, you know, for it to have validity for making credentialing decisions, a passing score has to really be tied to what we mean by credential worthy performance in that same way. And so a standard setting study is a formal process by which we look at the entire score scale, look at the entire breadth of performances we could have on an exam, and divide that up into meets qualifications and performances that don't meet qualifications. Specifically, we focus on the abilities of somebody who's just minimally qualified, somebody who's right here at the transition point between qualified and unqualified, and just on the meet side. So we think of somebody who's just barely qualified, and we try to systematically look at an exam and decide what score would a person like that get, because that's a score that would correspond with the minimum level of competence we're comfortable with giving a credential for. So that's really what we are doing here. Standard setting study is a process of mapping a quantitative thing, a qualitative thing, the concept of minimal competency, and translating that into a test score. What test score aligns with our concept of minimum competency? All right, what do professional standards say about standard setting and cut scores? And I have multiple sources here for, and I have some lengthy quotes, so please bear with me. And also, I don't want you to have to take my word for it. So you can screenshot these and come back to them later if you want to read some more. But looking at some of the professional standards out there, NCCA and others, say things like the cut score shouldn't be adjusted to control the number or proportions passing the test. And also on this slide, tinkering with cut scores just to hit a particular proportion of candidates to pass raises some serious problems about the technical quality of the test scores and threatens the validity of those interpretations. So a plain English interpretation of these technically worded quotes is that, well, we shouldn't just pick a pass rate and then go find the cut score that gives us that. Right? That's not a valid way of setting a cut score, of saying we think 80% of people, we'd like 80% of people to pass, so whatever cut score gives that. So you can't do that, and you can't just and you shouldn't. The standards say you shouldn't just tinker with your cut scores to get the pass rate that you want. Right? Well, here's some more references about cut scores in multiple sets of professional standards. I'm looking at the Burroughs standards that you may not be familiar with, but ABS and C, that's a nursing specialty certification standards, and also some from ICE documentation down below. The first quote talks about resulting cut score recommendations from a standard setting meeting. And it then also talks about the final cut scores that are adopted and used, implying that they may be different, right? Also here, the next quote says, the adjustments to the results of the standard setting process may be made if necessary. So that's another standard saying we can do a standard setting study and get results, but then change them afterwards or choose something different. Also in the ICE documentation and some materials they put out, the results of the standard setting study versus the actual standard that apply. All three things here say that there is not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between the score that comes out of a standard setting meeting or the results of a standard setting meeting and the actual cut score that gets applied. But I just got done telling you we're not supposed to be tinkering with these cut scores, right, to hit a certain pass rate. So what's the discrepancy here? Well, I think it's because that standard settings, and actually others agree that standard setting is ultimately a policy decision, because policymakers are the ones with the authority and the responsibility to determine those final cut scores, because policymakers have that right and responsibility to consider factors that are beyond just that one standard setting study. And in your organization, the public member or members may also be included in that body of policymakers. In other words, it's not the psychometrician who has the authority to grant or take away credentials, right? It's the organizational, the governing portions of the organization. So in the same way, those governing policymakers are the ones that have the responsibility for making the final decision about what the cut score should be. So you might be thinking, well, but Brett, in our organization, we always just have the psychometrician tell us what the cut score should be. Right? For our exam, or if you want to be more technical about it, we always just use the average rating from our standard setting panel. We bring in a panel of a dozen subject matter experts. We run them through a process. They all give us recommendations and we average them together. Okay, those might be things that happen. But think about this. The first bullet here, let the psychometrician tell us. That is delegation of decision making. And the choice to do that is itself a policy decision. Or adopting a decision-making rule like using the average, the choice to do that is also a policy decision, right? We could have chosen the median or something else, some other measure. The work and the decision of setting a cut score can be delegated, but the responsibility for the outcomes of those decisions can't be delegated. That responsibility remains with policymakers. So, and if you think I'm putting too much weight on them, it's not just me. Here's some more quotes for you to take back. The role of the standard setting panel is to provide information. The decision-making body then can choose to make adjustments to the passing standards before implementing them. It's a policy body that possesses the authority and responsibility for setting standards. After considering all the relevant information, the policymakers choose the operational cut scores. Decision makers have the responsibility and a right to consider factors beyond standard setting panels recommendations, making final course cut score assessments. You may be you may not know this, in your group, but it turns out if you were to look up the people that these quotes are from, these are kind of, in many cases, rock star psychometricians. So it's not policymakers saying this is what we have. This is psychometricians or psych researchers in the field of psychometrics, professionals in that area, saying it's the policymakers whose job that is. So that's the whole premise of this half an hour or so that we're going to spend together talking about it, is that because policymakers, including public members, are the ones with the authority and responsibility to determine the final cut scores, who have the final say in what actually happens, the deciders. And because when we're doing that, a rationale should be provided whenever those policymakers decide to deviate from standard setting recommendations, which in those quotes I showed you before said that's something that's allowed to happen. To me, it follows then that policymakers, including public members, should have, number one, a formal and systematic role in setting the process. If they're going to be responsible for it, they should have some say in what goes on. They should have sufficient information to guide their decisions. If they're making a decision, it should be an informed decision and not just a rubber stamp. They should, in order for it to be informed, because these things are somewhat technical, they may require some instruction in the standard setting process and how to interpret standard setting results. So this is, I should give credit to my friend and colleague, Karina Owens, who is also a psychometrician that I work with. We presented this as a workshop at the last ICE conference, which is why you see ICE 2021 branding on here. But this is a customized version just for you, my public member friends. So that has the extra red blocks that come up and says, hey, wait a minute, take note, public members. So what I'm going to, instead of working with at the conference, we use this as a process to help inform, professionals within organizations, maybe an assessment director. I want to point out specific areas to you, because being a member of this group, I've often heard, or I've heard several times at least, public members speak up about being nervous about sharing their opinion, or not feeling like they have a voice when they're on a board full of subject matter experts and they're a novice, they're a non-expert, they're representing the public. They don't understand the technical aspects of the profession they're working in. I work with engineers and architects, and I would be terrible at either of those things. But I want to give you, hopefully you feel empowered from this to know the kind of questions you should feel comfortable asking. If somebody comes to you as a public member, as you're serving on a board or a group saying, hey, we have a standard setting coming up in a couple months. We're going to be meeting up with you about 6 months, a month or so after that, for you to give the final approval of the cut scores that we find. If that comes up, this is kind of a little bit of a roadmap to help you speak up and get involved in those decisions if you're going to have a role to play. So if you hear that from the staff of the organization you're working with, this is a place for you to speak up and saying, hey, wait a minute, if we're going to be called on to approve these things, I'd like to see the following. And so maybe things like the bullets I have on the screen here. I want to see, like, what's our role going to be in this process? What information are you going to provide us? Okay, for us to understand that, you need to explain the methodology you're using. Those types of questions. All right, really, and from my perspective, well, as a psychometrician, a good cut score is one, again, that's supported by validity evidence, right? We're always talking about validity, right? We could do all kinds of good standard setting methods that would give us that. But as a policymaker, as a public member of a board, a good cut score to me not only is supported by validity evidence, but also has broad stakeholder buy-in. So the people who use this exam believe that the cut score is the right one, right? Because if they think it's wrong, think it's way too high or way too low, that harms the credibility of your organization and damages the value of your credential. Also, it should be accepted as fair and reasonable. I want when my organization sets a cut score, I want stakeholders and people who use the exam to believe that it's fair and reasonable. And so that's a question you can ask as a public member when the topic of standard setting comes up. Ask the question, how are we going to make sure that the cut scores have broad stakeholder buy-in? If it's only psychometricians in a room and no information is ever shared about this process with the public, how do we expect people to get to believe us that the cut score is the right one? How are we going to assure, how will we be assuring that the cut scores we adopt are acceptable or accepted by stakeholders and are fair and reasonable? Remember, this is stuff in the box that you can say. So speak up, public members, and ask. This is the type of questions you might want to be asking. One way, and maybe your organization doesn't do this. Maybe they've never done it. Maybe it's always been, we decide to do it. We hire an organization to run our standard setting meeting. They write us a report. The cut score is in there. We adopt it and we go on. That happens. And it's not wrong to do it that way, but it's likely you're getting the first piece here. You're getting a cut score that's supported by validity evidence, but it's less likely you're getting the other two. How can we do those other two things as well? You may be familiar with the concept if you've done, project management or things like that, or worked at organizations, some organizational leadership roles. RACI matrices, a responsibility assignment matrix. I'm going to show you an example of a way that it's to be handy for an organization to say, how could we plan for a standard setting in a way that would make sure we have the right people involved at the right places? This is an example of just a skeleton of what you might be doing. So just a responsibility assignment matrix, or a RACI matrix, if you look it up, RACI, you can look that up, and it's well covered in the project management things. But we just basically, down the left-hand side, we write down everything that has to get decided. And then across the top, we write everybody who's potentially involved in the process. And then for each row, we identify people or multiple people who have different types of interaction with that decision. Are they responsible? Are they accountable, the person with the final decision-making authority? Are they consulted? Are they somebody whose opinion is sought? Or are they just informed about it? Here's a bad example. In this case, but suboptimal, let's call it. In this case, all the decisions are made by a psychometrician, psychometric support. Occasionally along the way, other people are informed, or we get a cut score, we reach out to some subject matter experts and get some input from them. I'd say this isn't the best way to go. Healthier models are more like this, with shared responsibility across different roles. In this case, I have the board of directors listed on here, and your organizational structure may have very different ones. So the point of this slide isn't to show you these are all good ways. The point is that there's lots of good ways. The particular decisions you're going to make may be different for your program, and the potential stakeholders, the folks who are involved, may be different for yours. Maybe in your case, as a public member, you're a member of the board of directors, right? And so also I want to point out that the board of directors doesn't have to be responsible for everything. And in some cases, we don't want them to be, right? We don't want them to necessarily the nuances of the day-to-day work of the business. We don't expect them to get involved in those areas. In the same way here, there are certain points touch points where we want that input from them. So what kind of input, what would be meaningful input to get from a board of directors or public members when considering doing a standard setting? Well, before the standard sitting starts, you could participate in the discussion about it and give your approval to the design. Get informed, here's what's going to happen, and learn about it, learn why it's good, the pluses and minuses of it, and then give your approval to it. You might observe the standard sitting study itself, not necessarily participate. You could, after the standard setting, you can review the results, ask questions, and approve the final cut scores. The benefit of having this kind of hands-on involvement of policymakers is you're expanding your input, right? If you know your NCCA standards, we want diverse input on decisions that are made. Hopefully you're increasing understanding, buy-in, and advocacy, right? Because buy-in and advocacy specifically from the board in this case, because they're the ones who are going to be called on to defend it if people are complaining about the results later on. So if they feel like if you're going to be expected to defend it, it's important that you understand what's going on. And also it helps balance that decision-making process. So I'm going to jump through some specific examples of how along the way, some of these elements that I have in the decisions to be made, how might you kind of spread that responsibility across the organization, or how might a public member get involved in each of those pieces, or what question would you be asking? So who's involved in a standard setting cut score? Well, it could have organizational staff, your strategic staff, your VP for assessment, or a director of examination programs. Almost certainly you're going to have some psychometric support, whether that be an internal psychometrician or external contractors. Subject matter experts are almost always used in standard setting studies. So a lot of times that's volunteers or people who hold the profession, because in order to judge how hard the test is and what's really essential for entry-level practice at whatever level your credential is, it's important to have people who understand the content. You may have an exam committee, you may have a board of directors, you may have external stakeholders. You may want to call out specific job roles at your organization. The cut score approval process, in terms of your role as a public member, a good question to ask is, what's our organization's cut score approval process, right? Who decides? Who has the final say what the cut score is? Because in the end, somebody has to decide. Who is it? How did it become that person? Why is it that person? Should it be somebody else? Standard setting methods. Here's some methods just to throw out there for you. Angoff and different variations of Angoff are some of the most popular, some of the most common used in credentialing. You'll hear modified Angoff used many times. Named after, unlike many psychometric things, it's not an acronym. It's actually named after a guy, a fellow named Bill Angoff, Professor Angoff, who came up with the idea, and we all like so much. The bookmark method, the Hofstee method, construction groups, borderline groups. I won't go into the nuances of those, but just be aware there are multiple methods. So you might ask questions like, as a public member, why is this particular method being proposed, right? Why are we doing it this way? I know there's multiple methods out there. What makes this method better than the other? It's reasonable for you to ask for alternatives, right? A good psychometrician should be able to give you an explanation of like, what's something else that would work? And why didn't we go that route? Why is this one better? What are the benefits of using more than one method? There's nothing saying you have to use a single methodology here. It's great to combine multiple methodologies. And even, and there's other parts of there's activities that are involved that don't necessarily fit with any particular method, but there's stuff that's good to do. Will the subject matter experts actually take the exam themselves? It's great to have people who are recommending cut scores for you actually take the exam, because can be a humbling experience, right? When you're judging how hard a test is, to take it under like realistic testing conditions, rather than looking at it from a more academic kind of bird's eye view as a policymaker. If you're actually taking it and see your own score, that gives you a more concrete experience about what the real difficulty of the exam is. Also, there are standard setting methods that it would be appropriate for you as a policymaker, as a public member, to participate in, right? Most of these rely on subject matter experts, right? But this one here, Hofstee, is a method. This is essentially the Hofstee method. We ask you 4 questions. What's the minimum pass rate you would accept on this exam? What's the maximum pass rate you would accept? What's the minimum cut score that you could accept for an exam? And what's the maximum cut score you'd exam? 4 questions, 4 numbers we ask for you. Why is it appropriate to ask those to you? Because these are policy questions, right? What's the minimum pass rate you would accept? The reason we're asking that is we know realistically that if our pass rates or our pass rates were 0%, for example, if nobody passed our exam, that'd probably raise some eyebrows, right? It'd probably harm our credibility. If nobody ever failed our exam, that could raise eyebrows as well, right? So there are values that are unacceptable for those, right? It would harm our credibility if it came out that our pass rate was X, right? And so you could provide some input there. The same thing with cut scores. If your cut score on your exam was 45%, and you'd have people coming out of the woodwork saying, whoa, wait a minute, that's a hard F. It's not even a D or a C. It's way below an F. That could harm the credibility of your program. If you had a cut score that was 95%, you could say, wait a minute, that's way too hard. So that's something you could provide to help inform the decision-making process. Right. This isn't the only method we recommend using, but this is one. If we're using multiple methods, this is a great way to help verify the reasonableness of the cut score recommendations. So I just want to put that out there for you, that there are methods you can get directly involved with, not just reviewing it as a reviewer or an observer. And so just again, how we use that, how the psychometricians use those Hofstee results, we kind of draw a matrix, you take a graph, draw lines on the highest and lowest values you can live with on both the percent correct. And then we say, okay, here are the cut scores that meet all those requirements, right? And then, so we say the real reasonable cut score hopefully is somewhere right in there. Panel composition. I'm going to jump through some of these things quickly to get through all we need to today, just so you have a good kind of broad picture of what's going on. Like I said, most of these methodologies rely on subject matter experts. So because we're not using, in many cases, very many, a dozen or so is typical. A program that uses a lot might use 20. Programs that have hard time recruiting subject matter experts could be down in the low single digits. More is preferred, but it's very common to have a dozen or 15 or so participants in a standard sitting panel. Because they're so small, usually you're hearing psychometricians tell you, hey, you need big sample sizes. Well, in this case, these are small panels. It's important that they're representative. So it's important to focus things on things like panel composition and the selection of panelists. So as a subject matter or as a public member, it'll be important for you to ask questions like, hey, this is a place for you to provide input and say, hey, I think it's important to have subject matter experts who are blank, fill in the blank, fill out the demographic group that's important that you feel like is underrepresented, or fill out the type of practice, the VA hospitals versus private practice clinics, to help ensure that the panel it represents these important stakeholders. Or put it another way, hey, I don't think our stakeholders would consider this panel representative if it didn't contain newly licensed folks or early career professionals, or professionals from this region of the country, if we left them out because it's a further distance to travel. Or it wouldn't be representative if it didn't contain international professionals, right? This is your chance to provide input when you're talking about things like panel. Defensible cut score range, just a term I want to throw out there for you, because we're using a sample of subject matter experts, right? If we picked a different sample that was equally qualified and put them through the exact same process, we'd expect that we'd get a similar cut score recommendation from them, but not necessarily identical. So for that reason, I think it's reasonable for your testing professionals, if you're making a decision, to bring to you a range of defensible cut scores for you to consider, rather than just they can make their case for what they think is the best, but because these are samples of people, every time we have a sample, we have a margin of error associated with that when we try to generalize from that sample to a broader population. That's why a psychometrician may give you an imprecise number, not because we are being wishy-washy, but because we're recognizing that there really is differences in opinion. And also, even within your 12-person panel, it's very unlikely that all 12 people in that panel recommend the exact same cut score, right? So it's reasonable to consider there's a range of defensible values from which you as a policymaker can help to choose the most defensible or the best, most reasonable value. What type of feedback could you expect to receive as a policymaker on a standard setting? First of all, note that the subject matter experts who are participating are getting feedback as well throughout the process. But let's focus right now on the feedback you'd get might expect as decision makers. You could expect information about the panel. What's the panel composition? The results of their recommendation. What's the average recommendation of the panel? How much were they varied? How much did they agree or disagree? What's a defensible cut score range? Impact data. What are the pass rates? The impact of those cut scores on candidates. How do those projected impacts compare with pass rates we've seen in the past? Right? You might see them shown graphic. You might ask for them to show graphically. Can you show me? So on this example over here on the left, this is the cut score recommendations from 6 different subject matter experts, and showing that they're not identical. They vary from person to person, but they're all in the ballpark. And here's this black line's their overall average. This blue line in this case that's the actual score those subject matter experts got on the exam when they took it themselves. So we can look at it and see, oh, panelist 4 recommended a cut score that was 5 points higher than that person got themselves. Yeah, can you tell us about that facilitator of the standard setting panel? You might expect to see a summary of your standard setting panel makeup, right? Hopefully you talked about this in advance of the study, but let's see some verification that they were able to recruit the important groups, the groups you thought were important. If some groups are overrepresented or underrepresented, that might affect how you consider your final recommendations. You can break out cut score recommendations, especially if you have a little bit larger panel and do a good job of getting recommendations. Break out those results, those recommendations by the panel demographics themselves. Do early career professionals recommend the same cut scores as more advanced, more experienced professionals? You might see this graphically. Here's a dot plot showing this is a distribution of, this is a really nice big standard setting panel. It's getting up in the 20 or so panelists. It's big enough we can break out and look at the recommendations and see that, oh, wow, it looks like our member board members are recommending, quite a bit higher cut scores than our educators are. Is that reasonable, or does that affect, if this pink area is our defensible cut score range that a psychometrician tells us, that says we can defend a cut score anywhere between 51 and 55, does knowing this information help us make a final decision? Do we want to lean on the opinion of recently licensed people a little bit more than people who maybe a seasoned practitioner or a member who might be more with extent withdrawn from or further away from actual practice? Impact data, it might be reasonable for you to ask for, show us the cut scores that we're considering. What are the pass rates associated with those cut scores? Not only what are those pass rates, what are those pass rates for different demographic groups? It may be that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is very important to us. If we have two equally defensible cut scores, say these two numbers right here, whatever they may be, but one of them results in more equitable gender or racial outcomes, that might be a good reason to go that route. That might be a little more fine-grained and kind of sample-based, but that might be something you could think about. But it's at least reasonable to ask things like, I'd like to see the impact of the proposed cut score broken down by gender and race. That's a reasonable thing for you to ask. It's reasonable to see, what are the defensible cut score range here? How does those values compare to our historic pass rates? Or how do they compare to historic pass rates of our other exams? If you have a program if you're from an organization that has multiple exams. So that's a question you can ask as a public member. How do pass rates from the proposed cut scores compare to historic rates for our comparable programs? A couple other things. Cut score revisions. All right. Ask questions like, what happens if after 6 months we see that the pass rates are way different from our expectations? What's our policy if we feel the need to adjust cut scores later? Right. So if we make a decision, can we change it? If we said it, so the question is, can we change the cut scores? Do we have a policy for that? If not, we probably should. How does that affect the pass-fail status of people that took the test in the meantime? You may not have thought of things like asking questions like, how do we know that our subject matter experts knew what they were doing? Right? That's an important thing to know. You could have your request that your facilitator actually has them fill out an agreement to proceed, saying like, before I continue, I understand what I'm supposed to do. I've been through the training. I know what I'm doing. What do we do with a disruptive panelist? If there's somebody there who's not following procedures or clearly doesn't get it, what do we do? Do we give ourselves permission to remove them to protect the process? Can we remove them from the analysis so they don't bias our results? You should have a plan for those sort of things. Just to conclude here, to finish up the discussion and give you a chance to ask some questions. That responsibility assignment matrix, there is a handy little tool to say, if your organization doesn't have one, that might be something you request they put together for you. It's they work with you as a board or policymakers to say, hey, let's lay out the important decisions we have to make to do a standard setting study and decide who makes them. So everybody agrees from the very beginning what's going to happen. And we don't become too meddlesome as a board getting in the day-to-day business, but we get to provide important input when we need to, because we know we have to make the final decision and we have to defend these decisions later. If we do that, if you formally include your policymakers and your public members in this process, hopefully that helps everybody improve their understanding of the standard setting process. It improves the representativeness by expanding the group of stakeholders that are involved in the decision-making process. When you share that process with your external stakeholders and candidates, hopefully that can help improve, to share and show your transparency and improve stakeholder buy-in. And ultimately, as a psychometrician in my day job, we're getting to better, more valid decisions. Remember, and that validity is the appropriateness of the decisions that we're making based on these actual test results. So I have thrown in here for you as well. I'll pop them up there. So if people want to revisit later and see some of those references that I included, if I jump through some of those quotes too fast, you can go see the original sources. If you have questions, we can ask them now, or if you think of them later, you can email me. Thanks very much. I really appreciate you giving the opportunity to share this with you. And thanks, Becky, for the request for bringing this up as a topic. I hope the group found it useful.